Hello and welcome to Army of Crime, the internet's only podcast. My name is Dustin, and I'm here with my co-host Matt.
Hello, everyone.
So, on this episode of your favorite podcast, we're going to talk about a comic book, but not just any comic book. This is a comic book entitled Judge Dredd America by John Wagner and Colin McNeil. And Matt, you are a big Judge Dredd fan, and it was you who wanted to do a Judge Dredd comic book on our podcast. And I believe we haven't done Judge Dredd before at all, have we?
No, I don't think we have.
So, for people who are maybe not familiar with Judge Dredd, because I know there's like a 30 plus year long running history with this series, what is the deal with Judge Dredd, and specifically, what is the deal with this comic book called America?
Yeah, so I wanted to do a Dredd story on the podcast, and so I just kind of tried to pick something that was just kind of good and also kind of representative of the whole Dredd ethos. Judge Dredd is a series. It's a comic strip in the anthology magazine 2000 AD that started, I believe, in 1977, created by John Wagner and Carlos Esquerra, and it is compared to like contemporary American comics. It's kind of an interesting thing. I think you could compare it to even though it's not creator owned, you could compare it to some of the creator owned things in that it's been trucking along since 1977. The characters all age in real time, and it's like one big story. They don't like reset the continuity or whatever. So the characters all kind of like grow up and change over time. Like the setting kind of evolves in a way that your mainstream contemporary superhero comics do not, which is an interesting point of comparison. Certainly, the superheroes are not the only comic. So Dredd is interesting. He is a judge, and in their world, it's like a post-apocalyptic wasteland controlled by the judges. The judges are judge, jury, and executioner. They're like law enforcement that have almost unlimited power, almost unlimited discretion, I should say, to enforce an extremely authoritarian set of laws. And it's a weird. It hits on a lot of quadrants because he's kind of a satire of like America, I think, in general, and also a kind of a satire of just like a commentary on like law enforcement or like police. And there are some trappings of superhero things. You know, he has kind of like a costume and like a shtick. Obviously, all the judges have the same costume, but you know, on his own as a character, Judge Dredd, it kind of has touches some of those same buttons that like a superhero might touch. And the weird thing of Dredd's world is he's ostensibly the hero, but like the system that he enforces is like really terrible. So there's always this dramatic tension between he's like subjugating the population, but also he's like the hero of the stories. Are you with me so far?
Yes. And so basically, what
oh,
you're saying is that Judge Dredd is like a fascist toady.
Now, see, this is where it gets interesting, and I don't know if we haven't even gotten to the actual thing we're reading, but if we want to go a little big brain on this, I feel like saying Judge Dredd is a fascist is kind of the overly reductive BuzzFeed article take on it, because I don't think that's what he is. Because like I would say like I'm an anarchist politically, but I love love Judge Dredd, and it's kind of a weird thing. But what makes him interesting is that he's like not crooked, and authoritarian systems as a rule in actual real life are like universally crooked, right? When someone tells you they're all about law and order, what they really mean is they're all about like subjugating the population or bringing out the big guns against people they don't like. You
And
know, we could even
transferring money from other people's pockets into their own pockets.
right, like authoritarian leaders, anyone telling you about law and order, they're universally crooked. I don't know. Somebody could find a counterexample, I guess, but like almost without exception. I don't know of exception off the top of my head. It's crooked systems. Authoritarian systems are always running off, you know, grift, black market, nepotism, all these other things. And what makes Dredd interesting is it's an authoritarian system, but he's not crooked. He's like the one guy who's not crooked. So he I don't think is a I would not say that he's fascist. He like means well within the awful system, right?
So what
Which
you're
sets up
saying is he's like Detective Frank Wrench from Arrested Development because he does everything by the book.
exactly. He always follows the rules. He's the guy who always follows the rules. He wants it to be the thing that it says on the pamphlet, and he doesn't understand why everyone else just can't follow the rules.
So then what is this story called America
So
about?
America is kind of a good representative Judge Dredd story. America is about the uprising. There's like a long running story in Dredd about people trying to agitate for more democracy, and Judge Dredd is 100% against democracy. He thinks that democracy is bad. We shouldn't have democracy. We shouldn't have a lot of freedoms because it just gets everybody riled up, causes more chaos. And so the story of America is there's a woman in it named America who is like part of a group that's like agitating for democracy.
And
And
it
so
should be
that's kind
said,
of the long running dramatic tension in like the world of Judge Dredd is the people of Mega City 1 are oftentimes trying to get more rights or whatever, and the judge system is trying to keep them in place, or
um,
keep them in their place, I guess. As we were just joking about before, in like their world, sugar is illegal, tobacco is illegal, comic books are illegal, like all kinds of stuff is illegal.
when you say that America, the character of America, is part of a group agitating for more democracy, in fact, I believe the group that she is a member of is called Total War, and they are unambiguously a violent terrorist organization who does they do like mass bombings of civilians. They're not there are like peaceful protests that the judges will go out and like womp heads, but the characters are what is part of what I think shades some interesting elements into this too is that the pro democracy people actually use, well, not so much in this story but in other Judge Dredd stories I've read, will have like fairly reprehensible methods. They're definitely like terrorists, which even though their goals are admirable, it kind of like makes the whole thing like a lack of like a real rooting interest.
Yeah, one thing that generally you don't get in some of these dread stories where they're trying to parse out exactly how their system works is it doesn't generally give you like easy answers, because Dread is in many ways like a jerk, right? He when it comes to like the democracy people, he's like really not on board with democracy. He's not crooked, but he's not he's not treating them with kid gloves either. And it doesn't really give you an easy answer. It seems simple at first. If you were to just describe Dread to someone, you'd say, "Oh yeah, he's awful. The system is the real enemy," and it is. But there's no easy answer that you can turn to and say they should just do this instead.
So in the story of America, you have the main character for the first segment is actually named, I think it's Benny Beanie.
Yeah, the other thing of this is sometimes the stories get very strange. So like Dread stories are very there's like I mean, I'm just thinking of across all Dread stories, there's like talking horses, and like wackiness. And this story does not really have I wouldn't say wackiness, but it goes into it's kind of a strange story.
Well, so the main character, whose name is Benny Beanie, basically he has this childhood. America is a childhood friend of his who he's been in love with, and he has a successful career as like a comedic singer, like a novelty songwriter. And he ends up, and I don't know if we want how deep we want to get into the story, but the he basically, when America dies, he has his brain transplanted into her body. And then as the story goes on, you have this guy who is so in love with this woman named America that he essentially decides to like live inside her body and like wear her, sort of. It's like you could almost read it as like a sort of like transgender, like gender dysphoria kind of angle, but like it's really not that, because the guy is just like so in love with this woman that he can't stand to see her die, so he like takes over living in her body.
Yeah.
And he and then they have a daughter. Basically, he in his own body impregnated her, and then she was brain dead, so he took over her body and then gave birth to their child,
Yeah.
which is the sort of like weirdness that you mentioned.
Yeah.
One interesting thing that I noticed in this comic book is that all of the art in it is credited to Colin McNeil, but and it should be noted that there's like 3 stories that kind of continue the same plot line, but they were created like kind of years apart and are collected into this volume, which I think is pretty standard for like Judge Dredd stories.
Yeah, the collections of these are all over the place because it's just one continuous story that just keeps going like forever. So sometimes it's sort of arbitrary what you choose to put and not put in the collection.
So the first part of the story is just called America. Oh, it was the premiere story in the Judge Dredd magazine. Came out, it looks like 1990, so like the early 90s. And it has this really nice, like kind of like painted art style.
Yeah, the art in the first story, the one that's just called America, is awesome. It opens with this awesome. It opens with this great full page spread of Judge Dredd standing on top of a bloody body with an American flag draped on it, with his like literally with his boot on it. And then when you turn the page, he's standing in front of a corpse with like a bloody corpse with an American flag draped over it in front of the Statue of Liberty, and then there's the statue of the judge's Justice Department like towering over the Statue of Liberty.
So yeah, it has this really nice, like really colorful, sort of like painted art style, which I like really liked. But then as the story went on, and I'm not really sure what the reason for this is, but the art changes even though it's the same artist, it like changes dramatically, and the next story is kind of fugly looking.
Yeah, it has this like I think like digital coloring.
Yeah, it has like a digital coloring, and it just looks like really like stiff and kind of like unexpressive. I did not care for, and I don't know if this is like a changing style for the artist or whether this was like an editorial mandate that it should look like a certain way, but the art in the second story is, I would say, noticeably worse than from the first story.
And that's one thing you get with Dredd stories is they change artists a lot. John Wagner writes like a tremendous amount of Dredd. But yeah, the art style changes dramatically. The third story, the one I haven't here, is called Cadet and is still by Colin McNeil, and he seems to have it's not the painted style from the first story, but it's I think it's a big improvement over the second one.
Yeah,
And what you get here through this is like these stories taking place years apart, where it's like this whole like saga, and it kind of turns into the story of this character, America Beanie,
who is the daughter of America Hara and Benny Beanie.
Yeah. So and like, and this is where it's the question that the best Dredd stories seem to ask is, what do you do about these kinds of awful systems? Because as a science fiction story, it's satire. There's a very strong like satire element, right? And they live in this authoritarian system, and this character named America, right? What should America do about this? And it doesn't really give you an easy answer because she becomes a judge, and there's some idea of that she's going to try and change the system from within. But we see in the story that there are plenty of crooked judges. Not Dredd. Dredd, in fact, brings the hammer down on a crooked or like a bad judge in one of the stories. But like the system itself is probably beyond saving. But what else would you try? Because they try other things throughout the course of this story. There's peaceful protest marches, there's the terrorist movement, and then you have America Beanie joining the judges to try and like be a good one from within. And it doesn't really give you an easy answer that any of those are going to be effective. And I think that's probably, I mean, some people might say that that's kind of a cop out or something, but like, I mean, it's kind of a fair, because what is the answer? I mean, who knows? What is the real answer?
Well, there's a line in the story where they say a good judge is worth 1,000 protest marches.
Yeah.
And I don't know that, I mean, I don't believe that it ends up really being the viewpoint of the author so much as the viewpoint of one of the characters, because there doesn't seem like the system that they live in is really capable of reform. And like you said, it's actually kind of sad when you think about like the main way that Judge Dredd would be unrecognizable as like a contemporary police officer is the fact that he's willing to crack down on his fellow police officers when they break the law, whereas in real life, police officers always like lie and cover for each other to get away with crimes.
Right. Like it sounds straightforward and you're like, oh, duh, but it's like a thing that doesn't exist in real life, which is the honest authoritarian. We don't go into that in this story, but there are other stories where you almost like feel bad for him because he can't understand.
Well,
Like
I believe he is actually somewhat sympathetic to the idea that the system needs to change or that the system needs to reform.
he is. There's
But
actually a line in here where he says something to that effect. He says, yeah, I mean, it's kind of non-committal, but he says something like, maybe we do need reform. I don't know. He says, maybe we do need change. I don't know. You get so close to it. Just don't try to do it all too fast.
yeah,
And
and
there are other Dredd stories where he tries to take a line against things that he thinks are bad policies, but he will never break the rules to do so. His only card to play is that he can quit and protest if they want him to do something that he thinks is wrong. He has a good speech right at the beginning.
yeah,
Where do I stand? I'll tell you where I stand. I stand foursquare for justice. I stand for discipline, good order, and the rigid application of the law. And grud help any limp wrist liberals who say different. The people, they know where I stand. They need rules to live by. I provide them. They break the rules. I break them. That's the way it works. The people like it that way. They need to know where they stand. Rights? Sure, I'm all for rights, but not at the expense of order. That's why I like to see that statue of judgment standing there, towering over liberty. Kind of a symbol. Justice has a price. The price is freedom. You know, he's not a bleeding heart, certainly. There's dramatic tension to be mined from his world. And of course, there's a little bit of a cheat because it is a comic book world, so sometimes he saves people from like space vampires or whatever.
well, it's also I think kind of ironic because Mega City One also seems to be a crime-ridden hellhole.
Yeah. Right. So it's
So
clear that whatever they're doing is not actually making anyone safer.
yeah, because there's all this talk of like, we pay the price of freedom for order, but is there actually order? Because there seems to be like roving street gangs shooting it out and like just massive crime waves happening every 5 minutes. So it doesn't seem like they actually have figured out how to reduce the amount of crime.
Yeah. And as a satire, I think it works just as like a contemporary, if you compare it to like we sit here in America under, like the war on drugs with an enormous prison population and like a militarized police department. And I think it's very effectively like that's the kind of thing that they're talking about, right? Because you're giving up freedom for order. Does the trade-off ever work? Does that ever work? I mean, I don't know if anyone could find me an example from history, but that's like those are the lines that you use when you're trying to justify that. And yeah, the only difference with Dredd is he actually means it, whereas in real life, no one ever means that when they say it. There's a Dredd story. It's not in this, but I can always remember where they do a random crime check. So they just like break into some dude's house and search through all his stuff to find what crimes he's doing, and then they find that he's not doing any crime at all, and they're like, that's really suspicious. We need to investigate further. Which is, how law enforcement, I think, as a whole treats like a population.
Right. In an
The assumption is that everyone,
adversarial
yeah,
stance.
right. So we're very much like the perfect satire, I think, of like America.
And interestingly enough, on the topic of reform, there's a growing idea in the United States that our police departments are beyond the ability to be reformed and need to basically be disbanded and something else put in to replace them, which is like the same question, sort of the same question that is at the heart of America as a comic book, which
Yeah,
is it possible to reform the system? And in this comic book, it clearly seems like the answer is no.
yeah. Or the answer is maybe, but not in any kind of way that feels like satisfying. In the Dread stories, there is in the Mega story. I mean, I think there is kind of a trend towards. I mean, not to give away a bunch of stuff from a bunch of other things, but like there is a trend toward giving up like a little bit of freedom because normally in Dread stories they have a thing where mutants are banished from the city.
Right.
And at some point, Dredd is supports this, the idea that the mutants should be able to stay in the city and not be banished, which is like like they open up civil rights to people that had previously been denied them. So it's like incremental, like glacial reforms.
Well, in
And
this
what would
comic, America at one point gives birth to a son that the city takes away because of, which definitely has echoes of authoritarianism in the sense that they are like checking for genetic purity.
I mean, in their world, it's like mutants. That's kind of one of the running trends in Dredd's world too. I do like Dredd stories. I think they're interesting. I think America is a good representation. There's a lot of different versions of this because we were just talking about that our two trades collect different stories. Like trying to collect Judge Dredd is like impossible because there's like a million printings of everything. Um, like I own a bunch of the complete case files. I just started at like complete case files 1 and went from there. And I'm not even saying that's like the best way of doing it because I don't know if it is. It's like saying I want to get into Batman, so I'm going to start with, Kane and Finger from way back when, and it's like probably not the best way to do it, but it's one way of doing it. So we have different versions of this, but I think the story America just by itself, whatever kind of other things are being packaged with it, is pretty good as like a representative Dread story.
I agree completely. It also has one of the things that I like in Judge Dredd, which is fun robot characters.
Yeah.
Uh, the main character, Benny Beanie, has a robot butler named Robert who has these really nice, like huge robot eyes, and is just like one of the most sympathetic characters. And then I don't know, it seems to be a thing in Judge Dredd that robots are called like call me something. Because then later there's a robot who's like a hairdresser named Call Me Anthony, and that's what it like says on his chest. And of course, Dredd himself once had a robot butler named,
Walter, who
yeah,
had a lisp.
yeah. But what did they do with the mutants, Matt? Did they exile them in Cursed Earth, or did they just kill them?
Yeah. No, mutants are exiled.
Okay.
This is actually an interesting Dread story. I think it's the Tour of Duty arc. Dread actually goes to check on what they do with the mutants because what they're supposed to do with them is sort of exile them to like colonies outside of the city. And then he goes to actually check on them. And they're basically like concentration camps where they're being used for slave labor. And like the people running the camps are like grifting them to make money off of them, which is not what they're supposed to be doing, right? They're supposed to just live in like colonies outside of the city. So then Dredd is very upset by this.
So it's supposed to be more of like a separate but equal situation,
Yeah,
if you
it's like being
will.
sent to Siberia or something. And like you mentioned, it's interesting with Dredd because, and he does that in this story where he will just throw if there's an officer that is bad, he just throws him right under the bus, which is not how it works in real life.
It makes me think of there's like a standard, like Dirty Harry or like American Cop, like impulse of like criminals, yeah, you got rights, and then like punch someone in the face. And I mean, Judge Dredd is kind of like that, but he, at the very small number of rights that people are delineated according to the law are something that he actually believes should be upheld.
Yeah, yeah,
Because he
and
believes in rights, within reason, but like he actually does.
right.
What I was going to say though is the last page in America is this. In America, the story, not America, the collected volume, is a close up on Judge Dredd's face by Colin McNeil, and of course, Judge Dredd never takes off his helmet, so the close up is like of where his like eye would be, but it's like really of like his helmet, and he says, freedom, power to the people, democracy, the great American dream. Don't kid yourself. We tried it before. Believe me, it doesn't work. You can't trust the people. So dream on, creep, but just remember that's all it is, a dream. America is dead. This is the real world. As he said, like America is dead, and this is the real world that we live in where the cops are out there they can literally do whatever they want to maintain order at the expense of everyone else.
It's some
Really, the
wacky science
story,
fiction year 3000 stuff.
right, yeah, has absolutely no relevance to real life, fortunately.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of in many ways, it's like the perfect satire of America with like the war on drugs and the amped up law enforcement and everything. And I think Dredd gets at some of that comic book superhero stuff in a way that, like, if you think of Batman, a lot of superheroes get to like kind of cheat, right? Because they're like cops, sort of, but they don't have to worry about who goes to prison or what the law is or whatever. Whereas Dredd has to like take responsibility for all of that, right? Like Batman gets to punch people and then say, "I stopped a crime," and then he goes back to his house and doesn't have to deal with whatever the system is. And if he doesn't like a law, he just ignores it or whatever because he's just a private citizen. So it's
He's
kind of like
a right-wing vigilante.
so it's a way of like, and this is true of basically all superheroes, Spider-Man or whatever, they tie the criminal to the lamppost and then go home. And it's a way of like having your cake and eating it too, right? Like I'm fighting crime, but I'm not part of the system. So I'm not responsible for any bad things. If anything bad happens, it's not my fault. No one ever has to die. It's all very clean and tidy and within the lines, and you don't have to take moral responsibility for anything that you don't want to. And Dredd as a character is like taking the responsibility. Like he's bearing the weight of it, right? You're like just taking it all in. So in many ways, it's a more honest, I mean, take on like the superhero concept. And again, it's probably somebody would yell at me and say Dredd's not a superhero, and I guess he really isn't. But in many ways, he kind of is. I mean, he's basically, he has like perfect aim and he fights hundreds of bad guys or whatever. So he's kind of a superhero in that way, and I think it gets rid of those cheats where like Batman, Spider-Man, whatever, never has to take moral responsibility. It's like a have your cake and eat it too situation.
Yes, because most all superheroes are, in fact, like reactionary vigilantes using violence to uphold the tenets of the system. And Judge Dredd is a
While not being bound by
like
the system itself,
is a licensed
which is the
police
cheat.
officer using violence to uphold the tenets of the system while being, responsible for said system. So Judge Dredd actually, if you want to place it in that world of like next to superhero comic books, which I don't know that I necessarily would, but it's like a more honest take
Yeah.
on that kind of a story. Whereas like Batman or something, you're not meant to actually think of Batman as like a rich guy reactionary vigilante who goes out like punching poor people in the face, even
Yeah.
though that's really what he does. And
Right.
Judge Dredd
It's like
actually
they're like,
makes you think about those kinds of things.
yeah, right. Because superhero stories are like basically I mean, a lot of, I shouldn't say all, but like a lot of them are like cop stories, but
Right, they're
but
basically like super cops.
but they build the cheats into the storytelling, so you don't have to think too hard about it. And Dredd takes out all the cheats. And
Yeah.
again, he has stories with talking horses and space vampires or whatever, so it's a rich tapestry.
So Matt, we talked about America, the Judge Dredd collected edition here, and we both, I think, are in agreement that this is a very well done volume, even though like the art is kind of uneven, and that's, I guess, a typical thing with Judge Dredd comics. But it's a really fascinating story. You're a Judge Dredd super fan. What other Judge Dredd volumes do you think are worth reading?
Well, it's a fascinating question, Dustin. I do like Dredd. I mean, I don't have an unlimited supply of money, so there are certainly not a lot. There are certainly Dredd stories that I haven't read. There's a lot that I have. I mean, the Cursed Earth saga is a good one. It's a very early story. It's very different from this. It's like a Western, basically. They're traveling. I mean, I didn't even mention that about Dredd's world, is that he can shift genres effortlessly because sometimes he goes into space and meets like wacky aliens, and then it's like sci-fi, straight sci-fi, and they go out into the cursed earth and it becomes a Western where they're fighting like flying spiders. And then, inside Mega City 1 is like a cyberpunk dystopia. Um, so like the Cursed Earth saga is good, where it's like a Western story. It's like a convoy story. That's like an early one. The Apocalypse War is kind of a classic story. Uh, and that's like this political, it's a story with them and the Russian cities, like the Sov cities, because the Soviet Union still exists in Judge Dredd. And it's a story about like nuclear war or like a nuclear conflict. Other good Dread stories would be, I mentioned the Tour of Duty story arc, which is probably not like up there, but I think it's an interesting one to tease out some of the weird contradictions in Dread stories. Um, the Day of Chaos crossover is a relatively recent-ish one that's really good.
So with that, we will conclude this episode. And Matt, if people on the internet want to find this podcast online or on social media, what is the is it possible to do that?
Yeah, so we're at armyofcrime.com. I'm at Twitter at Army of Crime. Dustin is at Twitter at Dustin444 at Dustin44444.
I believe that's correct. Yes.
Yeah, and you can leave us a review on whatever your pod catcher of choice. Toss some stars. And remember, kids, never break the rules.
Always break the rules.
Yeah, or always break the rules. But pick a side. Do one or the other. Put some stars on there. That's all I want. That's all I need.